Thank you so much for joining me on MyFlora Fridays, which is a new podcast. Dr. Russo, you are one of the most prolific and respected doctors in the cannabis space, I feel. So I'm happy to welcome you here, and I think we'll have a good conversation.
Thanks for
So
having me.
yeah. So I'd love for you to give everybody a little bit of your background to begin with and kind of tell people who you are, what you do, and cannabis.
Sure. So I'm a neurologist by training, but about 7 years into my practice, I realized I was getting less and less benefit to my patients with conventional treatment, and I was getting really disillusioned. Unfortunately, in neurology, you don't cure much of anything. If you're lucky, you can provide effective treatment for whatever condition. But at that time, I turned back to a childhood interest in medicinal plants. Make a long story short, after taking some night classes in Spanish, I took an unconventional sabbatical in the rainforest in Peru in 1995. When I got back, I realized I wanted to transition into a research career and quickly became embroiled in the cannabis controversy. By this time, it was 1996. Prop 215 was going on in California, which really was the catalyst to medicinal access to cannabis in California, then the nation, then the world. Um, Things really evolved from there. So I began doing a deep dive on cannabis and the endocannabinoid system and was really enthralled with the science. Um, and decided that I would try to do formal government-approved research on cannabis to treat migraine.
Hmm.
Basically, I got stonewalled by the government for a period of 3 years between 1996 and 1999, but decided to go ahead and start writing and publishing. My first article was on cannabis and migraine. That caught the attention of Jeffrey Guy, who was the founder of GW Pharmaceuticals, a British company that had permission from the British Home Office to develop pharmaceutical forms of cannabis. So I was an advisor to them for 5 years, at the same time that I had a full-time neurology practice and was doing writing and editing. I have my own journal, a Journal of Cannabis Therapeutics, which published for 3+ years, and also a book program at Hayworth Press on alternative medicine. In 2003, GW asked me to come on full time as senior medical advisor to the company, a position that I held for 11 years, which took me through some 25 phase 1 to 3 clinical trials in the development programs for Sativex and Epidiolex, which remain the only two pharmaceutical products derived from cannabis at this time. Along the way, I was serving as a liaison to basic scientists around the world. Um, and during that time, I was chairman of the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicines and president of the International Cannabinoid Research Society. Subsequently, I spent some time at two private companies that unfortunately didn't provide me what I had expected. And then in 2020, right before the pandemic, bad time to start a company, we founded Credo Science, um,
Hmm.
which is a company dedicated to making cannabis safer and better. We have a number of silos of activity which we can get into, but all towards that goal.
Okay. Wow. So you've had one of the longer histories of cannabis medicine. I mean, cannabis has only been really accessible here in the United States for um what 30 not 30 years.
Yeah.
Sort of,
Right.
right?
So yeah, I've been at it during that entire time.
Yeah. So that's amazing. And I can't imagine how, when you started out, when I started my PhD in uh 2015, they're like, my advisor was like, I would cite something and it would be an internet blog or a book, not a peer-reviewed study, because there really wasn't like a lot of things that had gone through publication. And I'm not in the medical field, so I wasn't really looking for medical literature. I was looking for stuff on the plant and the genetics of the plant. And there really wasn't a lot of research out there. And so I can't imagine 30 years ago when you started out that there was a whole lot of, you know, literature to turn to as there are in other
Well,
fields.
no, that's true. I mean, a lot of the focus then was on the newly discovered endocannabinoid system.
Hmm.
However, that didn't thwart me
Right,
because there was a huge body of literature with regard to medical aspects of cannabis. It just was historical.
right.
And, a lot of it was prior to 1937 when cannabis prohibition came in the States. So I did a tremendously deep dive, which has continued over the last 30 years, on historical underpinnings of the use of cannabis. And it may surprise people that what people claimed in the past has proven out in modern times. Um, whether through the basic science or subsequent clinical studies, to be quite accurate. Um, I mean, the way I explain that is, sure, we have great technological advances, um, say the last couple of hundred years, but I don't think that the human brain has evolved to any great extent. There were geniuses in the past,
Hmm.
and they were also keen observers, and it's really amazing in retrospect to see some of the insights that people who are using cannabis medicinally had on the results that they got with their patients. So I've always used that to inform approaches in more modern times. The trouble is that we're still playing catch up. We went, through 70 plus years of total prohibition, and there's a lot of lost ground to make up, and there are a tremendous number of impediments and roadblocks along the way, whether they be political or funding or
Funding.
so. This is not an easy business in which to operate.
It's not. And I always say, the thing about people who are you know, cannabis enthusiasts, they're often very innovative and they think outside the box. And because we've never been able to do things the traditional way because of all the prohibition and things that have been placed on the plant. And so we kind of have to, when I was doing my PhD, I had no funding. I couldn't apply to the NHS or, this any kind of pool of money that is normally accessible to somebody doing research for a PhD was not accessible to me. And so I had to figure out how was I going to get the research done with no money. And I think I got out of my PhD uh, under $10,000 and managed to do all the genetic work and stuff that I did. And people ask me, why did you use microsatellites or the SSRs instead of like genomic work? You should have done whole genome, And I'm like, we can't with no money. That kind of research is really expensive. So I had to use a different tool, a cheaper tool, in order to answer the questions that I had. And I I have read a lot of the historical uses, and I do teach on the history of cannabis. And so, some of my favorite uh, historical reference is William O'Shaughnessy treating children and talking about heroic doses. I didn't know heroic doses was like an actual like term. I thought he was, like I'm giving it is huge doses, but I thought that was such a funny term. And the way that he describes his patients' reactions to cannabis is kind of incredible. And prior to prohibition, prior to 1937, which wasn't really prohibition, it was just an enormous tax that was placed on anybody who was
Well,
growing.
functionally, it was
Right, right. So people couldn't pay that tax, so they couldn't grow it, they couldn't sell it, whatever. But most people had some sort of cannabis tincture or solution or something in their medicine cabinet. Um, because it treats so many different things. So,
sure.
I think it would be really beneficial if you could speak a little bit about that. Why cannabis is, people say that it does this and it does that and it does that and this, and how can it treat so many different
Right.
things from one single thing? That seems crazy.
Yeah. So, yeah, you've put your finger on an important aspect of this. So the explanation is this. Until about 1990, we didn't know how cannabis worked. There was this idea that maybe it disrupted cell membranes in the brain, a la what alcohol does, ethanol. Um, Despite not knowing how it worked, a number of pharmaceutical companies back in the day had developed synthetic cannabinoids that produced intoxication in animals or would in people if used that way, but they still didn't know where the site of action was. So people looked at the situation and eventually um, a, a cannabinoid receptor was identified. This is in the lab of Alain Hallett on 1988. So if there was a receptor where cannabinoids worked, the next issue would be, is there something endogenous within our bodies that acts on that receptor? So that was the next goal. And Professor Mechoulam's lab um, found it. This was work by Devane, Ben Shabbat, Mechoulam. This is about 1992, I believe. And they identified an endogenous chemical that they named anandamide. And that's really a great name because Ananda means bliss in Sanskrit. So very clever naming. Subsequently, another endogenous cannabinoid was found, 2-AG, 2-arachidonyl glycerol, and a whole bunch of additional related chemicals, some of which were very active on this cannabinoid receptor, and some that really didn't have a lot of activity. Um, and along the way, a second cannabinoid receptor was discovered called CB2 for cannabinoid 2. That one's different. So CB1 is the receptor where THC works that produces the high, or if you will, the intoxication of cannabis. Um, but that's not all it does. This is responsible for analgesic, pain-reducing effects. It is responsible for anticonvulsant effects against seizures. It works on emotion. It in low doses reduces anxiety, and high doses can induce anxiety, which, by the way, is something the Sumerians described 4,000 years ago. There's an inscription for or against panic in relation to cannabis. So again, what's old is new again. Um, uh, but along the way, the field has burgeoned. In 1998, Professor Mechoulam and Ben Shabbat described what they called the entourage effect. This is the idea that in concert with anandamide, um, other substances which might not be very active on their own produce a synergistic effect. And the
Hmm.
same thing applies to the plant. Um, in addition to THC, the plant makes something on the order of 150 related cannabinoids that can enhance THC's medical benefit and also reduce its side effects. And this has been a big focus of my research during the last 30 years.
Hmm.
And then the field has expanded. We now have this umbrella term, the endocannabinoid system, that includes not just the endogenous cannabinoids, anandamide and 2-AG, but takes into account the receptors, the enzymes that make these chemicals, and then a bunch of related targets, neurotransmitters like TRPV1,
Hmm.
the serotonin 1A receptor. So these are what are part of what's called the endocannabinoidome. So this big branching network of receptors and endogenous compounds that work on the receptors. So getting back to the question, um, the reason that THC in cannabis is so versatile in treating a wide variety of conditions is because of its activity on the endocannabinoid system. Because the endocannabinoid system is the master regulator of human physiology. It is what maintains even keel, technically homeostasis.
Right.
So, in other words, in the brain, if there's too much activity in a certain system, let's say there's too much glutamate activity, what the endocannabinoid system will do is bring that back down to a normal level.
Hmm.
And similarly, from the other side, if there's an underreactivity, it will bring it back up into the normal level. Um, and since the endocannabinoid system functions in every physiological system in the body, it neatly explains the versatility of cannabis-based drugs. So whatever it is, whether it's in the brain, or it's the digestive tract, or it is the liver, the heart, there's always a role for the endocannabinoid system, which makes it a crying shame that this stuff still isn't taught in medical school or residency programs.
It's
We've
not.
addressed that with a recent article.
It's
Um,
good.
I should throw out here that um, I I have a website, ethanrusso.org. It's my personal website. At the library tab there, people could have access to some 70 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, etc., and without paywalls or copyright issues. So,
Thank you for providing that for it's those paywalls are a doozy. If you don't have a university affiliation to get access to some, $35 a pop is ridiculous. And I
yep,
just want to get up on my soapbox here. People don't realize, they think that scientists make so much money with all of their research for companies and whatnot. If you're in academia, it costs you money to publish. And when you publish something, you don't get paid like you do when you publish a book. You pay thousands of dollars for them to publish it, and then in addition to the money they collect from you as an author, they collect the money from the paywall. You don't see a dime of that, right? And I don't think enough people realize that, with research, there also comes a lot of cost. And so I published, I think, 5 or 6 papers from my PhD research. And it was, I either had to beg that they would waive the fee because I didn't have any funding, or that the school would pay for the publication fees.
sure,
So, the endocannabinoid system that kind of governs everything, and it's awful that it's not even taught. I taught anatomy and physiology all through my graduate program, and I went back through all of my anatomy and physiology books. And yeah, most of them have like a paragraph on the ECS, and that's it. I think one of the books had like a page and a half, but it's really for how important it is in the body. It's just crazy that they haven't added it to the medical or anatomy and physiology courses yet. It should have its own whole section, just like the lymphatic system or the muscle system or the digestive system. These students learn all these
sure.
things, and the ECS is completely missing.
Right. Well, what
And
we hear from medical school deans is, okay, fine. So you want to include the endocannabinoid system in the curriculum. What are you going to take out? Well, let me play both sides here. I went to medical school 50 years ago. Um, it was a pretty rigorous course then. We've learned a lot in 50 years. So, yeah, there's more material to learn now. However, if you have a system that basically helps run everything else, don't you need to understand it to have a concept of normal function as well as disease processes? So I don't buy that argument at all. Um, uh, One of the publications at the top in the library at ethanrusso.org is a study in which I collaborated. It was a Delphi process where we laid out what the important things are in terms of endocannabinoid system and cannabis education. And again, I'm going to plug here at ethanrusso.org. There also is a link to our educational platform, which comes in different flavors. The big one is a 40-hour online platform that covers all of this material in great depth. Um,
And is
and
it
that
more
one does cost.
and it's and I'm assuming that that one is more geared towards doctors and nurses who are looking for a really comprehensive understanding, deep knowledge of the ECS and how they can use that information to then guide their patients, right?
That's exactly right. So it would really be geared towards the physician, nurse practitioner, or caregiver that wants to advise patients. However, we've had a dispensary manager who has completed the course, and sometimes they're just interested people. So
Hmm.
that's the big course. There's a shorter 10-hour version which covers the basics of the endocannabinoid system and cannabis. And we also have a sports-oriented module.
Oh, nice.
Um, so, yeah, I mean, part of one of the silos of Credo science activity is education, and we've always taken that very seriously.
Yeah. Also, I mean, you can never have enough education. Education is a big part of my life. I think Dr. Danielle Vergara and I are entering our 21st semester of teaching cannabis science. We do teach the endocannabinoid system and um, medicinal and therapeutic applications and also methods of delivery. But I wouldn't say I have a deep understanding of how this all works, like the the receptors and all of, the internal physiology uh kind of goes over my head. I've always had a problem with that, but
Well, it's complex. I
it is
mean, people
complex.
like simple explanations, and there are short answers and there are more comprehensive answers, and we've tried to provide the latter for those who really want to dig deeply.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for folks that speak the language of physiology, more power to them and definitely learn that stuff. Uh, I might actually have to take the course just so that I can get a better understanding.
Well, you'd be welcome.
Okay. And then you mentioned it, you just kind of touched on it a little bit, but I want to know more about how t THC and probably, I mean, I don't know, CBD, the cannabinoids are biphasic.
Yep.
At a low dose, they do one thing, at a high dose, they do another thing, and how that can be either beneficial or detrimental in some
Okay.
cases.
Sure. Well, yeah. It's interesting in a variety of languages going back to Greek. The word toxicon means both medicine and poison. And you have exact parallels to that in many South American indigenous languages in the Amazon. Um, and, everything has a side effect. You can kill yourself if you drink too much water.
Hmm.
Water is vital. Again, the biphasic dose response refers to the fact that cannabinoids typically do different things at different dose levels. I previously mentioned how very low doses of THC have an anti-anxiety effect. At too high a dose, it flips over into anxiety and paranoia. Similarly, there was a brilliant animal experiment with cannabidiol. What they showed is in rodents that a low dose didn't treat pain, a middle dose was effective at treating pain, but if you exceeded it by too much, you lost the pain relieving effect. Interestingly, when the same doses of CBD were used as an extract rather than as a pure compound, you didn't get the loss of activity. In other words, they could continue to increase the dose of CBD and it continued to benefit pain responses in the rodents. Um, Another thing with THC is everybody knows that low doses of cannabis are useful in allaying nausea associated with chemotherapy when people are
Hmm.
getting their cancer treated. So a low dose helps you not get sick, but too high a dose of THC can make people nauseated and vomit. Um, uh, so again, it's a happy medium, and this is a reason that we really encourage people to slowly increase or titrate their doses. The other reason for that is to avoid the development of tolerance, where people are pushing their dose higher and higher in an effort to attain a certain level of high. Um,
Right.
the good thing is, after a short period of abstinence, the tolerance is gone and um, they don't require as much. Interestingly, although tolerance develops to the intoxicating effects of cannabis, in regular use for treating pain or other medical conditions, we don't see this development of tolerance. In other words, it's not like an opioid where if you're treating chronic pain, you often have to increase the dose over time, increasing side effects and the possibilities of withdrawal. We do not see this with cannabis at all. So if someone has a stable pain condition, they often can use the same dose of a cannabis-based medicine effectively for years. And this has been very well demonstrated in both the Sativex studies we did at GW Pharmaceuticals, as well as studies of herbal cannabis that have been done clinically.
So what you're saying is that if somebody is treating a condition, they can take cannabis and instead of at some point they'll reach their effective dose, then they can stay at that dose and they'll no longer be getting the intoxicating effects. They're just taking their daily medicine and then going about their business as usual. So they're not actually getting loopy every day taking their
Yeah,
medicine. They're just
yeah,
getting
that's really
medicated.
the ideal. The other key factor here is the dose required to treat symptoms is often considerably less than that produces the high or intoxication. This was an issue when GW started the program in 1998. We didn't know that for sure, but that was adequately demonstrated later. And what's interesting is there, we did a study, a phase 2 study of Sativex, cannabis-based medicine with roughly equal amounts of THC and CBD, and as well as a smattering of other cannabinoids and terpenoids. So it was cannabis-based.
Hmm.
Um, the FDA wanted a dose ranging study, meaning that we forced people, instead of them deciding their dose, they were forced into certain dose ranges, 1 to 4 sprays a day, um, 5 to 9, or 10 to 12.
Hmm.
Interestingly, the lower doses worked the best. And the higher doses not only didn't work as well, they were the ones with the side effects.
Hmm.
So, one of the truisms that we can state now is that you don't want to keep going up because at the same time that you're creating side effects, you're losing efficacy. Um, and subsequently, there was a cap at 12 sprays a day because beyond that, you're adding to side effects without really gaining anything on the therapeutic side. In other words, if you get to that level and your pain isn't treated, going higher is going to make things worse. Um,
And maybe the cannabis treatment isn't for you if it's not working at low or
well,
any
that
dose.
happens. The
Yeah.
difference is, in neurology, uh, with one or another conventional medicine and neurology, you can treat most conditions effectively in two-thirds of the patients. There's always a third of patients that it doesn't work, no matter what you do.
Mm-hmm.
However, those same one-third where nothing works also can take cannabis and have it work most of the time. All the studies of Sativex that were done, whether it was in multiple sclerosis for spasticity, for pain, for neuropathic pain, for cancer pain, all the studies that were done in a situation where this was added on to an optimized regimen. In other words, you only got into the study after you tried all the available drugs and they'd failed.
Mm-hmm.
So, it really makes you wonder how would things have been if we started with it rather than make you take a bunch of tricyclic antidepressants or anticonvulsants to treat your pain. So, again, when you're getting two-thirds of the one-third, that's quite an improvement,
Mm-hmm.
considering that conventional medicine didn't give them anything of benefit previously.
And there's story after story after story. I mean, anecdotes are not, data, but there is story after story after story of patients who are on, a ton of pharmaceutical drugs. They start taking cannabis and they're able to start removing some of the pharmaceuticals that they've been on potentially for years. And some of them even are completely free of the pharmaceutical drugs, and are only using cannabis to treat whatever condition, which I think is super cool.
And the obvious import there is with respect to opioids. So we have somewhere between 80 and 100,000 Americans dying of opioid overdoses a year.
Hmm.
There have been numerous studies that have shown the opioid sparing effect of cannabis, as you mentioned. So typically in pain conditions, people can substantially reduce their opioid load or get off of it entirely. And considering the fact that outside of cancer pain, it's been amply demonstrated at this point that there's no benefit to chronic opioid treatment for chronic non-cancer pain. It just doesn't work. Um, Again, side effects accrue, benefit doesn't eventuate. So,
Right.
um, this really is it's not a gateway drug, it's a gateway off of other drugs that are more damaging and or addictive.
An exit drug.
Exactly.
Okay, so the endocannabinoid system is made up of your receptors, your enzymes, and then whatever cannabinoids, whether they be endogenous or exogenous or phytocannabinoids. Lots of people like to partake in cannabis because it makes them feel good.
Sure.
Lots of people like to exercise because it gives them that boost of anandamide, which makes them feel good. I am one person. I have never gotten a runner's high. I have been an athlete in years and years and years ago. Never felt a runner's high. I also don't respond well to THC. It makes me feel icky, and it doesn't really like 2.5 milligrams in an edible is like my max dose, and anything more than that, like it really messes me up for an extended amount of time. And I've always wondered, like, is my ECS somewhere, is it broken? Do I have too many receptors? Do I have not enough receptors so that when
Well, yeah, it's a
like,
good question. We don't know. Right now, we don't have technology that tells us the state of your receptors. Um, Crude as it is, the best way to tell is to do a lumbar puncture, a spinal tap, to get a sample of the cerebrospinal fluid and measure the anandamide and 2-arachidonoglycerol directly. And
hmm
that's been done in certain cases. In migraine, for example, it was demonstrated that there are vastly lower levels of anandamide in people with migraine than in people who don't have it. Similarly, in people who develop post-traumatic stress. Matt Hill did a study of survivors of the 9/11 situation and showed again deficiencies in the endocannabinoid function. But we don't have a scan that, for example, you could take now that tells the state of your receptors or the level of your endogenous cannabinoids. But it brings up an important point. People differ in what we call their endocannabinoid tone.
Hmm.
And one of my theories has been, and this has been amply demonstrated through studies like I just mentioned, that certain conditions are associated with what I call the clinical endocannabinoid deficiency.
Hmm.
So this includes things like migraine, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, where we don't have any lab tests that shows what's wrong. Obviously, people are hurting and have associated symptoms. And it turns out that there seems to be an underfunction of the ECS in these folks. And therefore, it makes sense that all folks with these conditions often respond very favorably, often to low doses of cannabis-based medicines.
So now what if you have a perfectly functioning endocannabinoid system? It's working just fine. You produce your endocannabinoids. You've got receptors that are doing their thing. The enzymes are making and breaking down these cannabinoids. And yet you are a consumer, potentially, daily uh, or chronic consumer. Can that mess up your endocannabinoids? Because the whole function is to maintain balance. And if
Yep.
you are flooding your endocannabinoid system on a regular basis, is that going to mess up your endocannabinoid system?
Well, it could. And what would happen is that the system will try to keep itself in balance. So if it has a barrage of THC on an ongoing basis, what it's going to do is inactivate a certain number of the CB1 receptors. So the person may continue to function okay, but if, for example, they're traveling and don't have access to their usual quota of THC, they may have some withdrawal symptoms. Now, the
Hmm.
bad news is they could have withdrawal and be irritable and not sleep well. However, it ain't like other drugs. There are no pink elephants and nobody dies. Um, in a period of days or at most a couple of weeks, they're back to normal. Um,
Yeah, I've heard people say that the withdrawal can be kind of brutal though, like with
yeah,
the
but everything's
nightmares.
relative.
But yeah, and if it's only for a couple of weeks, nightmares is a common thing that people talk about. Um, you know, issues with appetite and feeling ill or whatever, those things their mood, irritable, um, things like that. So, um, and that speaks to, taking tolerance breaks, right?
Yes.
So yeah, to try and not have to go through that. Uh, and so, okay, so we have to talk about this conversation has been going on for years now. We have to talk about cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, which I know that you have done studies on. You found a potential genetic predisposition to CHS. There are folks that are adamant that it is pesticides.
Oh, they're
Uh,
adamantly wrong.
I feel like, yes, like smoking pesticides could make you
Oh,
ill,
yeah, no
but
doubt.
okay, can you please explain to people why CHS is different from a pesticide poisoning, and that, and some people say, well, if you're having CHS symptoms, you should bring your weed and you should have it pesticide tested because it's the pesticides. And I've read a bunch of stuff, and you've done the research, so bring it.
Well, they could get their cannabis tested and it might have pesticides, but it wouldn't explain the problem because it's clear that perfectly clean, organically grown cannabis can still produce cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So let's start at the beginning. What is it? This is a condition that was first reported in Australia in 8 patients in 2004. And one of the patients had had symptoms since 1996. So they called it cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And that was a good name, and I'll get into why later. But The story was this is a group of people who were regular cannabis users that developed a constellation of problems, including nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and uh, the odd phenomenon of having the symptoms abate for a period of time if they took hot showers or baths. So this started out being rare, but was increasingly recognized um, over time, and certainly is far and away more prevalent in the US than anywhere else. This hardly ever is reported from Europe. And there are reasons for this, and it has to do with the availability of potent material. Um, it has become apparent and amply demonstrated and documented that this is due to too much activity at the CB1 receptor, and that comes from THC in cannabis, or it can come from synthetic cannabinoids. Since I think we have the time, let me explain a very important case report. There was a fellow who developed CHS with his cannabis use, but he had a job where he was going to get his urine tested. So he stopped using cannabis and turned to synthetic cannabinoids, things like K2, spice, delta 8, THC, and redeveloped CHS symptoms. So after a period, he'd not used any cannabis, herbal cannabis for 6 months, went into the hospital with continued vomiting, had the usual extensive workup at great expense. They tested his blood. They did not find any THC or phytocannabinoids, plant-based cannabinoids. They did show that demonstrated what he said, which was that he had synthetic cannabinoids in his blood. When stopping those, the symptoms went away. Um, so, what happens in CHS is that over time, people develop symptoms, and they may just start out uneasy, anxious, nausea, and then it advances to horrendous level of abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting.
Mhm.
Um, uh, People have tried to ascribe this to pesticides. Now, I am dead set against pesticides. In 2016, I wrote a whole article about the massive contamination by pesticides of cannabis in the Washington state supply, legal supply.
Mhm.
Um, we had an independent lab test. We showed terrible amounts of some 25 different pesticides. Each of those has some toxicity. None of them match what happens with CHS at all. And the same is true of neem. Neem is, or its main ingredient, is azadirachtin, is an extract from a nut that comes from India, and it's used as an organic pesticide in cannabis cultivation by some people.
Mhm.
Um, at ethanrusso.org, there is a recent article. There are 3 articles about cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. The last one really dives deeply into how this is not related to pesticides or neem. Neem can be toxic. Again, its symptom complex doesn't resemble what happens with CHS at all. So if it ain't from this contamination, what is it from? Well, it was always apparent that there are some people that use huge amounts of cannabis and have never had nausea or vomiting problems. And there are other people that develop this, and once you have it, your tolerance goes out the window entirely. People will stop for a while. Invariably, they start in again after a period of time. And anytime they're escalating the dose, things that wouldn't have gotten a fly high before will trigger more episodes of nausea and vomiting.
Mhm.
And there's a complex relationship there that the article goes into. Um, but it's a situation where there have to be differences between people who are susceptible to CHS and those that can use cannabis in huge amounts with impunity and not develop problems. So what does that tell us? It tells us that people are different. How are people different? They're different genetically. So a few years back, we tested this hypothesis and did at the time, which was the largest survey of people with CHS. And when people had a diagnosis of CHS and had ongoing symptoms, they were eligible to enter the program and have genetic testing done. We compared the folks with cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome to people who are high volume cannabis users that didn't have any of the symptoms and looked at their genetics. Um, we had hypothesized three things: that it could be a problem with the CNR1 gene that codes for the CB1 receptor. That turned out not to be the case. However, we hit for two or three. We thought it could be a problem with the TRPV1 receptor. TRPV1 is a heat receptor. It's where hot chili peppers work. And it also explains why the hot bathing um, alleviates symptoms for a period of time. In people with CHS, there was a much higher percentage of mutation on the TRPV1 gene. The third hypothesis was that it could have a problem, there could be a problem with metabolization of
Mm.
THC. So there's an enzyme in the liver called CYP2C 2C19. There's a 2C9 and a 2C19. Both of them showed a greater tendency to have mutations in the CHS patients than those who didn't have it. So there were two genes. We didn't hypothesize the next ones. There were two genes having to do with dopamine metabolism. One was COMT, catechol O methyltransferase, which is the enzyme that breaks down dopamine. And the other is DRD2, which codes for the dopamine 2 receptor, which is the target of antipsychotic drugs. Now, both of these mutations have some important implications because mutations on these genes will indicate a potential for addiction, not just to
Mhm.
cannabis, but to opioids, alcohol, etc.
Just addictive behavior, sort of
Exactly,
symptoms.
and that can include gambling, um, sex addiction, you name it. Um, and the other is certain forms of mental illness, including attention deficit disorder, um, psychosis, um, all a whole grab bag of difficulties. And then the last one was a total surprise. I mean, the dopamine makes a lot of sense because folks with CHS are uniquely resistant to the idea that cannabis is what's making them sick. And despite being told that and faced with the evidence that, look, it's the cannabis that's the problem, we see relapses like you wouldn't believe. I've seen people lose jobs, good jobs, because of CHS, and just continue to go back to what is causing the problem. The
And
last one was,
not to mention racking up huge medical bills, right?
yeah,
It's because
yeah,
they,
back in 2012, they showed an average expenditure in trying to get a diagnosis after scans and barium enemas, $96,000. And I'm sure that's higher now. Um, but the fifth gene was really eye-opening. It's called ABCA1. This has to do with cholesterol metabolism. Um, People who have mutation on this gene are susceptible later in life to heart attacks, coronary artery disease, and development of Alzheimer's disease. So let's just look at that by itself. Let's say that someone has CHS. Wouldn't it be important to know when they're 25 that they're at risk for developing heart disease so that they could institute certain lifestyle changes now before they die of a heart attack when they're 45 or sometime later? Um, unfortunately, this hasn't gotten the traction that we had hoped. Uh,
Mm,
Subsequently, you can say that we had developed a big consortium of experts, and we're going to do a massive follow-on study of CHS, looking at genetics again, metabolomics, also psychological testing. Um, and we had to shelve that basically for two reasons. One was the National Institutes of Health, uh, which has never had adequate funding, wasn't really recognizing or showing interest in this diagnosis. That's one. Second is political. If things weren't bad before, the budget is down the crapper now. So there was no chance we were going to get our study funding, and I had to pull the plug, which is really unfortunate. But still, the doubters persist, and I hear regularly from folks that try to say, but, that it could be Neem, or there was a guy who decided it had something to do with hop latent viroid. Hop latent viroid is like a primitive virus that stunts the growth of cannabis. Well, that's a bad thing. However, not only has hop latent viroid not ever caused a human illness, there's never been any plant virus that's made the jump to humans.
right.
So, it's
Well, viroids don't even infect humans in general, right? I
uh,
mean,
well, I'm going to take your word for it. I hope that's true.
I believe that I looked it up because I don't remember why, but I could be wrong. I don't know, but I have a recollection that viroids generally don't infect uh
Yeah. Well, it
people.
isn't HLV what's making you sick. So,
Right.
again, I am
And
anti-pesticides. I've been an organic farmer for decades.
uh,
So, no, I don't like the idea of pesticides on cannabis, but that's not what's giving you your CHS.
well, and Megan Bang, who you probably know, the trusted cannabis nurse, she made a really good point on it's always on LinkedIn, it's always a, conversation. But she made a really great point is that there are a buttload of people who take CBD, concentrates, gummies, smoke CBD type flower. There are no regulations on CBD flower in the United States at all. All you have to test for, and if you're a hemp farmer growing for CBD, all you have to test your flower for is that it's under 0.3% total THC prior to harvest, right? You can apply pesticides if you like. Why wouldn't you? There's no rules. You don't have to get it tested for pesticides, heavy metals, any kind of contaminants, toxins, microbes, nothing. So if cannabis hyperemesis syndrome was caused by pesticides, wouldn't it be showing up in people who are taking a bunch of CBD, myself included?
Yeah, you might expect that, but let me go on from there. One of the questions we asked folks with CHS was, have you tried a pure CBD product and what happened? And I've got to say at this point, we can't say that you're safe with that kind of product because most people said that they still had problems with it. Um, the difficulty is that most CBD products are not totally free of THC. It's difficult you can't breed the THC out of
Well,
CBD.
I'm not saying that.
No, I agree with what you said.
Right. Yeah. Like, so people with CHS can still be affected and still have episodes if they want to switch to something like CBD to try and,
They may, yes,
but
very
what I'm
likely.
saying is we would start seeing people who are taking CBD products, um, if it was pesticide related, because there's a ton of,
Yeah,
presumably,
I agree with that wholeheartedly.
right.
Sure.
And I think that was a really good point. And
Yep.
again, with the synthetic cannabinoids that can trigger episodes that
Yes.
have
And
never
again,
even,
just to
yeah.
emphasize, it's been documented that Delta 8, which is in is available on the commercial market is invariably synthetically produced. That triggers CHS as well. Um,
Yeah, but you can make Delta 8 from CBD, which means that it
right.
still did technically come from a plant. And I guess in that conversion, maybe if there were contaminants, they could get pulled
Well,
through.
it could be that, but if
But
you had pure Delta 8, that also would trigger it because it works on the CB1 receptor as well.
there's too much evidence that it is the THC that's causing this condition, right? And it is so funny the people that are adamantly fighting CHS is caused by cannabis, caused by THC, caused by cannabinoids. Um,
Well,
it's
I'm afraid some of these people, some fraction are delusional. And, there's a line Anthony Hopkins had in a movie. Um, uh, it was wishing does not make it so. Uh,
mm,
and that's the case here. I mean, I have had friends with whom I've had this argument.
hmm
Nobody wants it to be due to cannabis, but it quite clearly is. So
hmm
let me get on the soapbox here a minute.
Sure.
Um, we still hear from a lot of activists that cannabis has no side effects. That's total nonsense. And anybody who advances that isn't going to be compelling. Um, it does have side effects, can have side effects. They're easily avoided. Um, CHS happens to be a rare situation where people that have developed this tendency should not use cannabis, period. Um, Sorry, but that's life. Um, you have to recognize that, yes, it is considerably safer than most pharmaceuticals. Um, so it is not the scourge of the earth, and it's not totally free of side effects. The truth often is somewhere in the middle.
I mean, it's a plant. Plants affect people. People have allergies to plants. Like plants have their own defense systems to stop things from eating them. Like
Correct.
it's not a reach that a plant is going to affect a person negatively when they consume it, whether it be smoking it, eating it, whatever.
True enough.
I am so allergic to cannabis pollen. It is crazy. When I was growing uh aquaponically in the Pine Barrens here in New Jersey, I could tell if there was a male or, a herm in the grow because I would start sneezing like crazy. Because I'm that allergic to the pollen. It's
Hmm.
nutty. Cannabis isn't for everybody. Like some people are allergic to nuts. Like even if you like the nuts, like if you can't eat peanut butter, you can't eat peanut butter. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah, blame it on your parents because it's no. If you get peanuts early, you can avoid the peanut allergy.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some minor cannabinoids.
Sure. So, what's new and different, according to most people? Our conversation is often the case in this context has been very THC centric. That ain't all the plant does. I previously mentioned there are 150
hmm
phytocannabinoids. We know a good bit about the pharmacology of about a dozen.
hmm
But in each case, we have found wild and wonderful things that they do that are quite distinct from the activity of THC. Very briefly, CBD has some 60 mechanisms of action. Now, that usually is a recipe for a lot of side effects, but as it turns out, almost all of the 60 mechanisms of action are potentially beneficial. So the good part of CBD is it's very versatile and could help treat a number of conditions. The bad part is it ain't potent. You need a lot of it as an isolate. However, combined with THC, it does very good things.
And what
Acts
do you mean by a lot of it? Like,
a lot of it. Okay, here's an example. Um, Bergamaschi et al. In Brazil did a study of social anxiety
hmm
with pure CBD, and it was effective. However, it required 600 milligrams of CBD at a time to have this effect. That is not practical because it's going to be extremely expensive. Um, in fact, now the next compound I want to talk about is cannabigerol, CBG. It
Hmm.
is equally effective on social anxiety at a dose of 20 milligrams and maybe less. So that's what, 5 times 6. So 30 times more
Yeah.
potent. Um, uh, CBG is, I like to call it the mother of all cannabinoids because it comes before
Hmm.
CBD and THC and CBC and the biosynthetic process. CBG doesn't really work directly on CB1 and CB2. It has other mechanisms of action. A newly discovered one this past year, Govanlu et al., was that it works on a peripheral channel called NaV1.8, 1.8. What this is a pain channel. It's not in the brain. So CBG seemingly has this remarkable effect on chronic pain without any potential for intoxication related to it. Um, with Kerry Cutler, we did the first survey of therapeutic use of cannabigerol a few years ago. That's at ethanrusso.org. And people found for 30 conditions that CBG preparations were in no case, um, uh, in each case, better than conventional medicine for treating their conditions. Foremost among them were the usual anxiety, pain, and insomnia, but also, although the numbers were low, great benefit for um, uh, things like inflammatory bowel disease, etc. So subsequently, we did the online lab study of CBG for anxiety. The remarkable thing was, um, although it was effective for anxiety, it produced no impairment. In fact, verbal memory improved
Hmm.
on CBG. So I like to say that what the world needs now is a non-sedating, non-addictive agent for anxiety, and that is cannabigerol. Additionally, it works on another receptor, TRPM8,
Hmm.
which is important in things like irritable bladder, prostate cancer. It can be a factor in certain kinds of breast cancer. And because CBG is remarkably non-toxic, hundreds of milligrams are well tolerated. This potentially could be a chemotherapeutic drug because it is cytotoxic. It kills cancer cells, but is preservative for normal cells. Um, and additionally, it's got a strong antibiotic effect. This has been known for a while. It is very effective at things, gram-positive bugs, bacteria like MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. However, the cannabinoids seemingly before didn't work on what's called gram-negative bugs like E. coli that come from the gut. Again, full disclosure here, I'm chief medical officer for Andera Pharmaceuticals. They have recently shown data, and more is going to be published imminently, combining CBG with cannabichromene, CBC, and a very low concentration of silver. Um, Silver sulfate, there's a triple synergy. This will kill not only the gram-positive bacteria, but also gram-negative bacteria and fungi. There's been no preparation previously in history that's been tested that's effective on those three groups of infective agents. Um, so this will be for topical use, like for wound healing or infection prevention. It also works on what's called biofilms. Um, so, uh,
Okay. Yeah, I actually know I don't know as much as I should, but I know a little bit about CBC and its potential for uh, wound healing and it's the antibiotic effects. Shameless plug here for a friend of mine, Dr. Harold Hahn. He has he does a couple of things, but Phyto RX is a product that they just launched not too long ago, and it's a nano emulsion in a pump. One pump delivers 25 milligrams of CBG and 50 milligrams of CBD. And both me and my significant other take it daily. I don't know that, I mean, I our arthritis pains, generally getting older type kind of stuff. But we really like it. And as a doctor, if you were to speak to everybody and using cannabinoids or cannabis as a supplement like a healthful sort of supplement that you would take daily for just general wellness, aches and pains, whatever. What do you think like a good daily dose of these things are?
It's really unclear to me what kind of quality control there's going to be attached to a given preparation that
Mm,
somebody in East Podunk is trying to get at
yeah.
the dispensary or the even the gas.
7-Eleven.
Yeah. So I have an article I did with Caroline McCullum on dosing and administration. If people are willing to dig in on my articles, there'll be a lot about dosing. But
Hmm.
that presupposes that you have a reliable product with a good certificate of analysis on
Yeah.
it, not something that was different 6 months ago.
Yeah, and I am speaking specifically either, you know, like if we could get pharmaceutical grade CBD,
Right,
CBG,
right.
CBC. I feel like uh we have recommendations for how much vitamin C you need per day, how much
Yeah.
vitamin D, blah 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 blah.
Well,
Is there
yes, it's
sort of
there's some general guidelines. I mean, let's start with THC because that's what's going to be available to most people. 2.5 milligrams is considered a threshold dose. Now, for someone, as you've mentioned, you may find that's plenty. Um,
Mhm,
but some people will feel that, most people will feel that, some don't. 5 milligrams is considered a standard dose by a lot of experts at this time. Almost anyone who's not tolerant is going to feel that, and it usually will be tolerated. I would actively advise people to work up to that level,
mhm,
particularly for therapeutic use. 10 milligrams is considered a high dose, and in anyone who's not already tolerant, they're going to feel it, and it may well be too much.
mhm,
Um, so there's that. Um, Dosing on CBD is a lot higher as an isolate. But in conjunction with THC, the more of it there is, the greater the likelihood that you will allay some THC associated side effects like anxiety, rapid heart rate, etc. Um, I will say with CBG, we know that 20 milligrams is very effective at anxiety, and usually, anecdotally, 10 milligrams is enough. Um, there's a study coming out with a higher dose that was well tolerated. I'm not sure this much higher dose is necessary, except again in the case of trying to primary treatment of cancer, for example. So,
And what do we know? What do we know about clinically about CBN and CBC?
okay. CBN, not a great fan. So people understand what it is. It's cannabinol. That's a non-enzymatic oxidative breakdown product of THC. In other words, if you discover that you had a bag of cannabis in the drawer for 3 years, it's not going to get you high. It will make you tired, but it's not because of the CBN. That is a misconception. Karun et al. Did a very good study some years ago looking at all the available literature on cannabinol, CBN,
Hmm.
and there's no indication of its benefit on sleep. However, why is it in all these sleep products? And the reason is everybody knows that old dope makes you sleepy, but it's not from the CBN. It likely is because of oxidation of the sesquiterpenoids. Oxidized sesquiterpenoids make you sleepy. So that's
Okay.
likely the explanation there.
Interesting.
There may be some benefits of CBN on mitochondrial function. There are also there are effects on uh, keratinocytes in the skin, but it's mainly hype. Most of the CBN that's out there is a way that industry has a way of salvaging old cannabis that's otherwise unmarketable. Now, that may be interpreted as the cynical view, but I,
Or converting an overabundance of CBD isolate.
right. Yeah, there's that. Um,
And so
okay.
then
Then
C
CBC, we know
CBC.
a lot less. It certainly has very active anti-inflammatory properties. Again, it may increase endocannabinoid tone. It has the antibiotic effects. It has the anti-cancer effects. Um, but it's produced from a recessive gene. It's very hard to find significant amounts of CBC in commercially available cannabis chemovars.
Hmm.
But it's an up and comer and deserves more attention.
We're looking for
Turning
it.
to THCV,
Yeah,
tetrahydrocannabivarin.
that
This
was
is
my next one.
THC, but there's a three carbon side chain instead of five. Um, it is a really fascinating compound because at low doses, it's what's called a neutral antagonist at the CB1 receptor. At high doses, it acts more like THC. The claim to fame for THCV is that it allays hunger and has benefits on metabolic factors like in the metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes. It could be used as a weight loss or regulating agent. Um,
And has this been tested in humans or it's gone
Yeah, unfortunately, it was all like 15 years ago, and there hasn't been adequate follow-up. But it is available in certain chemovars.
through?
Plugging one in particular is Pink Boost Goddess out of California, which has roughly same amounts of THC and THCV. People that use it find it very manageable. They feel good, but they're not impaired. So again, this is the idea of having the benefits of THC, but without so many of the possible side effects.
Yeah, I know I can think off the top of my head of at least three, either 1-to-1 THCV to THC. There's even one I've seen that came back at 20% THCV, which I think is amazing. Um,
I, I'm not sure I believe it.
well, it's available through Zenetics, which is a clone supplier. And it has been tested and I don't know, but maybe it needs to be
Now,
tested
was
again, but
that naturally bred or was it genetically modified?
I can't answer that question. I don't know, but it's out there.
Well, yeah, I mean, potentially, I don't believe in genetic modification.
I don't know of
Plant.
anybody really who has successfully genetically modified any or like genetically modified cannabis and brought it to market. That is unless you consider polyploidy a genetic modification, but I don't know anybody who's successfully like inserted genes and brought that to market. They may be out there, but I'm not aware of any of them.
Okay, hopefully not. I'm sure there are people interested in
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
it.
Well, and then there's also CBDV, right? Uh,
Sure.
and do we know anything about that?
Not that much. There were two clinical trials. CBDV has anticonvulsant effects, and it works on what's called seizures of partial onset or focal seizures. Unfortunately, it was tested as an isolate, and in the two clinical studies, it didn't work, even though all the basic science was supportive. If it had been up to me, I would have suggested that it should have been used as an extract, and I bet it would have worked then.
Hmm.
And then there are other things that people have claimed. There haven't been any other formal clinical trials.
And then, okay, so this is my last one, I think. I can't promise, but I think. So recently, I think in the last 3 or 4 years, THCP was discovered, and it's
Yeah,
got a longer side chain. So THCV has a shorter one,
7, yeah.
THCP has a longer one.
Right.
It's found when it is found, it's found in incredibly low amounts, and remembering that amount doesn't always equal potency. We can have things in incredibly low amounts that are very, very potent or very, have very, very large effects. And so I'm assuming that nothing has been done on THCP yet, but I want to ask you since you are,
Well, yeah, this is one of the things that the business aspect is far advanced of the science. So, as you said, THCP, tetrahydrocannabidiol, was discovered by an Italian group in tiny amounts um, in a sample of cannabis. I knew about it a lot earlier, but wasn't allowed to publish. Um, that's another story. But it is 33 times more potent at the CB1 receptor than THC. So the first issue is, why do you need that? Um, uh, THC is what's called a partial agonist at the CB1 receptor. This is a system that works best with gentle nudges, not big pushes. Um, Unfortunately, THCP has been on the market. Um, you can get insane doses of THCP either online or in gas stations in certain states. Um, I can't advocate it at all.
yeah,
The THCP that is out there is invariably synthetically produced.
right,
Um, and that means that there's a high potential for other contaminants, residual
byproduct,
solvents, you name it. And
right.
you may have a very bad experience in pursuing your curiosity on THCP. So,
Yeah, I definitely am not interested at all in ever trying it. Like in my brain, the way I see THCP working is that it binds to the cannabinoid receptor and then does not let go. And
yeah,
so you end up being very, very high for a very, very long time.
yeah,
Sounds
story attached.
awful. That sounds
I
terrible.
There's a well-known cannabinoid scientist who should remain nameless, who took a synthetic cannabinoid on a weekend, fortunately, but basically was incapacitated for 2 days. Um, and but for his girlfriend being available, might not be with us.
Man, you
Um,
got to have that babysitter when you're having a bad time.
yeah, well, it's just not an experiment to undertake.
No, and it's sort of reminiscent of some of those um synthetic cannabinoids that you touched on, K2, spice,
Right.
those things that have a really large affinity for the receptor they grab on and they don't let go. And so you end up being really high for a really long time.
Yeah, it may sound good, but it's not.
Mm-mm, sounds like a terrible time to me. Are there any, I probably asked you all the exact same questions that everybody always asks you. Um, is there anything that you wish people would ask you or that you want to like talk about that you never
Yeah.
talk
Uh,
about?
how to invest in research because we're facing a crisis here. As I mentioned, things were bad at the National Institutes of Health before. Now it's an absolute disaster. So what's left is for private industry to fund research, but the conventional pharmaceutical companies don't look towards natural products. They want to create a synthetic drug that's computer designed to work on a specific receptor with the highest
Mm.
potency and affinity. And they may discover 10 years from now that it's got some dreaded toxicity, such as killing your liver or killing your bone marrow.
Or your
Um,
unborn babies,
there's that. Flippers are not what arms are supposed to look like. Um, so,
thalidomide. Thank
yeah.
you.
So, uh, I there's some really good opportunities for investment out there. Genuine research on phytocannabinoids, plant-based cannabinoids, and people will be hearing a lot more in the next couple of years about some of the great work that's being done.
Yeah, I feel like, you know, and even when there was money available for cannabis research, more often than not, through the NIH, it was we want to study this cannabinoid for this symptom or for this ailment or what. It was like this thing for that. It was not like we just want you to, you know, have a look and see. The exploratory research wasn't really isn't what the NIH does. And I've been saying for a long time that, people were, oh, we need more research. We don't know enough about this and that and the other. The money for that kind of research is gonna have to come from inside the industry. Um, and of course there are companies that are doing their own internal research, but they don't want to share. They're
Well,
doing it for their, products, and they don't want to share.
yeah, it's worse than that, Anna, because it's really it's a scattershot proposition. It's like we have this cannabis chemovar, we'll give it to a bunch of people and see what they think. It that doesn't move the needle.
No.
In terms of the hierarchy of evidence uh, based medicine, that doesn't count for anything. Without controls, scientists, physicians don't accept it, regulators don't accept it. And these studies where you've got people using 15 different preparations and saying that, well, their depression got better or their pain got better, that may be true, but it doesn't guide people to what they need.
Mm.
So unfortunately, it is the case that you need a specific preparation. You need to know exactly what's in it with a certificate of analysis. You need well-controlled study, and you need it to be in a sufficient number of people. Then they call it evidence. And that's unfortunate, but that is the way the thing works.
I do like the research that Riley Kirk and Miyabi Shields are doing, where they're, gathering data from regular consumers. uh why are they regular, are they treating ADHD, or and what time do they wake and bake? Do they consume all day long? How much do they consume? Are they smoking? Are they taking gummies? And they have, at this point, they have thousands of participants that are filling out surveys, and while that's not a controlled clinical trial, they are gathering real data from real people who actually use cannabis for specific things. They're medicating themselves and are figuring out what's working for them. And when we talk about pharmaceuticals, when you go to the doctor and you say, I'm depressed, the doctor might say, okay, I'm going to prescribe you this because it seems to work well for a lot of people. You might come back 2 weeks later and be like, you know what? I hate this. I can't sleep. I'm having nightmares and I've gained 20 pounds. The doctor will say, okay, well, that obviously was not the drug for you. Let's try this one. It works pretty well for most people. But then there's also, you still have to mess with the dose, perhaps, either increase or decrease the dose to make, if I feel better but I'm still a little sad, okay, let's increase the dose, or let's add in this other thing that will help it be more uh efficacious for
Sure.
what we're trying to treat. So, and cannabis is a medicine, and it's a similar situation where there is some onus on the patient to pay attention to how you're feeling when you consume, at what time, if you eat a meal, if you're drinking it with you're drinking water. and paying attention to, what you're putting in your body and the effects of it so that you can um, talk to your medical advisor and start to figure out what's best for you. And there are lots of people out there that are doing that themselves because there aren't medical providers or doctors or physicians or whatever that know enough about cannabis to do that work for them or to help them with that. But obviously, you're trying to change that with your intense
All right.
ECS
All right.
courses. Yeah. So this has been an incredible conversation. I don't know if you have any questions for me or if you have any other, I mean, you've already told us where we can find you at ethanrusso.org
Right.
and Credo Sciences. And I know you're also doing some work still with True Terpenes, right?
Yeah, just as an advisory capacity.
Kind of formulating terpene
Uh,
profiles to,
yeah, they have a line of products that I formulated that's going on 6 years ago now.
it's still pretty cool though. It's still pretty cool. So, yeah, I mean, people can find you I know I've emailed you before and you're very generous with, answering questions and things like that. So, thank you for coming on and talking to me. It's been a
It was a
pleasure.
pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.